I witnessed humanity storm the battlefield and discovered why worlds tremble. The dropship screamed through the atmosphere of Theris 4 like a falling meteor, and Valeth pressed herself against her restraints as the hull around her groaned from the heat of re-entry. She had made planetary descents before, but never like this, never so fast, never so steep, never with the constant chatter of anti-aircraft fire exploding around them like angry stars. 30 seconds to landing zone, the pilot announced over the intercom, her voice impossibly calm. Given the chaos outside around Valeth, the human soldiers had gone quiet. Their earlier conversations replaced by a focused stillness that seemed to compress the air itself. She watched them check their weapons one final time, watched them exchange glances that carried entire conversations without words, watched them transform from individuals into something else entirely. Sergeant Quan Hai Jin sat across from her, eyes closed, lips moving silently in what Valeth assumed was some form of pre-battle meditation. Then the sergeant's eyes snapped open, and she looked directly at Valeth with an intensity that made the Corvani observer flinch. "Stay behind us. Stay low and keep moving no matter what happens," Quan instructed, her voice leaving no room for questions. "If you freeze, you die, understand?" Valeth nodded, not trusting her voice. The dropship hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact, and the rear ramp dropped open to reveal a hellscape of smoke and fire and screaming weapons. The humans did not hesitate. They poured out of the dropship like water through a broken dam, their weapons already firing at targets Valeth could not even see. She stumbled after them, her legs shaking, her hearts pounding so hard she could feel them in her throat. The landing zone was supposed to be secured by orbital strikes, but the Drogathi had dug in deeper than anyone expected. Massive insectoid warriors emerged from underground bunkers, their chitinous armor gleaming in the firelight, their weapons spitting plasma bolts that turned the air itself into a weapon. Valeth saw the first human fall within seconds of landing. Young soldier caught in the chest by a plasma burst that should have killed him instantly, but instead of dying, he kept firing from the ground until another human grabbed him and dragged him toward cover. "Medic!" someone screamed, and a human with a red cross on her armor sprinted through the open kill zone without any regard for the death flying around her. This was madness. This was suicide. This was everything the coalition commanders had warned about, and yet the humans did not stop. They advanced into the gunfire, using their fallen comrades as motivation rather than deterrent, their formation adapting and flowing around obstacles like a living thing. Valeth found herself pulled along by Sergeant Quan, who moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for such a small creature. "They have us pinned from that ridge," Lieutenant Choi Min Seok shouted, pointing toward a Drogathi heavy weapons emplacement that was cutting down humans with every burst. "Then we take the ridge," Sergeant Quan shouted back, and before Valeth could process what was happening, the humans were charging directly toward the source of their deaths. She had seen courage before. Every species had soldiers who would risk their lives for victory, but this was different. This was not courage born from confidence or superiority or even desperation. This was something older, something deeper, something that seemed to burn in every human eye like a fire that refused to die. The Drogathi on the ridge were elite warriors, veterans of 100 conquests, bred and trained for exactly this kind of defensive combat. They held their position for approximately 4 minutes. Valeth watched in stunned silence as the humans swarmed up that ridge through a hail of plasma fire, losing soldiers with every meter they gained, and never once slowing down when Sergeant Quan reached the top. She was bleeding from 3 different wounds, and her armor was scorched black from near misses. She killed the Drogathi gunner with her bare hands. "Ridge secured," someone called out. And just like that, the impossible had become reality. Valeth climbed the ridge on shaking legs, stepping over bodies both human and Drogathi, Her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. The Coalition had spent 3 months trying to establish a beachhead on this world. The humans had done it in less than an hour. How? She whispered. Not really expecting an answer, Sergeant Quan heard her anyway, pausing to reload her weapon with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. How what? How do you keep going? Valith asked, gesturing at the wounded humans being treated nearby, at the dead being carefully arranged in rows. You are dying. Your people are dying, and you just keep moving forward as if death means nothing to you. The sergeant considered the question for a long moment, her eyes distant. Death means everything to us. She finally answered, her voice soft despite the continued sounds of battle in the distance. We know we are going to die. Every human knows this from the moment we are old enough to understand it, and we carry that knowledge with us every single day of our lives. Then how can you fight like this? Quan smiled. But it was not the fierce grin of a warrior. It was something sadder, something that spoke of ancient grief and hard-won wisdom, because we have already accepted the ending. Observer, we made peace with death a long time ago, and that peace set us free. She gestured toward the horizon, where the Drakathi capital city waited behind walls that had never been breached. Those creatures think they understand fear because they cause it. The sergeant continued. They think they understand death because they deal it. But they have never truly faced their own mortality, never accepted that one day they too will end. And humans have? Every single one of us, every single day. Sergeant Quan shouldered her weapon and turned toward the distant city. That is why we do not run. Observer, not because we are not afraid, but because fear stopped controlling us the moment we understood that death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person. What is the worst thing? Valith asked. The sergeant did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the planet around them, at the smoke rising from destroyed villages, at the mass graves visible in the distance, at all the evidence of Drakathi cruelty, living without purpose. She finally said, dying without meaning, that is what we fear, not death itself. The human forces began to move again, pushing deeper into enemy territory. And Valith followed them with new understanding forming in her mind. She was beginning to see what made these creatures so terrifying. It was not their weapons or their tactics or their physical abilities. It was the simple fact that they had nothing left to lose except the things they had already decided were worth dying for, the Drakathi. For all their strength and cruelty, had never faced an enemy like that before. The battle for Theris 4 had only just begun. And already Valith could feel the balance of power starting to shift beneath her feet. I witnessed humanity storm the battlefield and discovered why worlds tremble. Valith had seen war before, but she had never seen hope die until she arrived at Coalition Station Theris. Massive orbital platform hung above a world that was burning. And from the observation deck, she could count 17 different columns of smoke rising from the planet's surface. Below, she was young for a Kovani diplomatic observer, barely 40 cycles old. And this was supposed to be her first major assignment, documenting the Coalition's defense of the Theris system against the Drakathi Dominion. Instead, she would be documenting a calling the Atuan. Retreat. We cannot hold this position any longer, Admiral Sorvin announced to the assembled commanders, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of resignation that needed no translation across species. The holographic display at the center of the war room showed the terrible truth in glowing red markers. 15 systems had fallen to the Drakathi in the past 2 cycles alone, and Theris 4 was next on their path of conquest. Drakathi were a nightmare given form, massive insectoid warriors bred for violence, commanding fleets that moved like swarms and consumed everything in their path. They had landed on Theris 4 3 months ago, and in that time they had slaughtered over 2 million civilians. Valith recorded everything with her neural implant, keeping her expression neutral even as her stomach chimed at the casualty figures. Scrolling across her display, this was her duty to witness and document so the future generations would understand what had been lost. We should evacuate remaining personnel and regroup at the Kovian line, suggested Commander Thrax of the Valori Confederacy, his scaled hide rippling with barely concealed fear. No one disagreed. No one had the courage to suggest they stay and fight. That was when the proximity alarms began to wail. Unknown fleet dropping out of hyperspace, shouted the sensor technician, and every eye in the room turned to the tactical display. Valith watched 12 ships materialize from the swirling chaos of faster-than-light travel. Their designs unfamiliar to her trained eye. They were smaller than coalition cruisers, built with hard angles and aggressive lines that seemed to bristle with weapons. Identify those vessels immediately, Admiral Sorvin commanded. Coalition database identifies them as Terran vessels. Admiral human military ships from the Sol system. Humans. Valith searched her memory for information about them, finding only scattered reports and vague descriptions. They were a young species, barely 2 centuries into their spacefaring age, considered too primitive and too few to matter in galactic affairs. What were they doing here at the edge of a war zone? The communication screen flickered to life, and Valith got her first look at a human face. He appeared older than most of the humans in her database images, with silver streaking through black hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. He wore a uniform of dark blue marked with symbols she did not recognize, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "This is Admiral Park Junho of the Terran Defense Fleet," he announced, and Valith noted how he pronounced each word with careful precision, as if he understood that translation software might struggle with his meaning. "We have received reports of Drakathi atrocities on Theris 4, and we are here to offer our assistance in the liberation effort." Silence followed his words. Admiral Sorvin was the first to recover, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like pity. "Admiral Park, we appreciate your offer, but I must be direct with you. We are preparing to withdraw from this system, not reinforce it. The Drakathi have entrenched over 200,000 warriors on that planet," Commander Thrax added, his tone carrying the condescension that older species often showed to younger ones. "Your 12 ships cannot change those numbers." Admiral Park's expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, something that made Valith's fur prickle with sudden unease. "With respect, Commander, we did not come here to change numbers," the human said quietly. "We came here because we saw the images of what the Drakathi did to those civilians, and we decided that someone needed to answer for it." "This is not about answers or justice," Sorvin replied, frustration creeping into his voice. "This is about survival, and the mathematics of war do not favor a ground assault against fortified Drakathi positions." "Then we will change the mathematics." The human admiral said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment Valith thought the translation software had malfunctioned. Change the mathematics of war against the Drakathi? Admiral Sorvin must have thought the same thing, because he shook his head slowly. "Admiral Park, I cannot authorize coalition forces to support a suicide mission, but I also cannot stop you from attempting one. I can only warn you that no species has ever broken a Drakathi defensive line through direct assault. There is always a first time." Park smiled then, a small curve of his lips that held no humor at all, and Valith felt something cold settle in her chest. "I would request one thing, however," the human continued. "I would like a coalition observer to accompany our ground forces. Someone who can document our actions and report back to your command. Would that be acceptable?" Every commander in the room exchanged glances, and Valith knew what was coming before Admiral Sorvin even turned to look at her. She was the junior observer, the expendable one, the one whose loss would mean the least to coalition records. Observer Valith will accompany your forces, Sorvin announced. And just like that, her fate was sealed. 3 hours later, she stood in the cargo bay of a human dropship, surrounded by soldiers who checked their weapons and spoke to each other in low voices. They were so much smaller than Drakathi warriors, so fragile-looking with their soft skin and their lack of natural armor, yet none of them seemed afraid. Sergeant Quan He-jin noticed Valith watching and walked over with a smile that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "First time fighting alongside humans?" she asked. "First time witnessing humans fight at all," Valith admitted. The sergeant nodded, her dark eyes holding something that Valith could not quite identify. "Then pay attention. Observer, you are about to see something that the galaxy has forgotten existed." "What is that?" Sergeant Quan's smile widened, but it never reached her eyes. "Hope?" The dropship shuddered as it began its descent toward the burning world below, and Valith gripped her restraints and wondered what she had gotten herself into. "I witnessed humanity storm the battlefield and discovered why worlds tremble 3 days into the campaign." Valith thought she understood humans. She had watched them fight through impossible odds, seen them carry wounded comrades through fire and death, witnessed their strange rituals of dark humor and quiet grief. She had learned to recognize the sound of their laughter, sharp and sudden, often coming at the most inappropriate moments, and the deeper sound of their silence when losses became too heavy to joke about. She had seen them at their most disciplined and their most chaotic, and she had begun to believe she understood what made them such fearsome warriors. She was wrong. The human forces had pushed deep into Drakathi territory, liberating village after village. And with each new settlement, they discovered the same horror, repeated in different variations: mass graves filled with civilian bodies, processing centers where the Drakathi had experimented on living prisoners, children separated from parents and shipped off-world to serve as slaves. Valith documented everything with her neural implant, forcing herself to remain professional, even as her soul screamed at the atrocities she was recording. The humans documented it too, their own devices capturing evidence that would one day be presented to the galactic courts. But something began to change in them with each new discovery. The joke stopped first. Valith noticed it on the second day, when they liberated a village and found only the elderly left alive. Everyone younger had been taken or killed. The usual banter between soldiers went silent, replaced by a grim efficiency that felt different from their normal focus. Then the music stopped. Humans she had learned loved music. They played it from portable devices during rest periods, sang together in rough harmonies during long marches, hummed melodies under their breath during quiet moments after they found the first children's mass grave. The music stopped entirely on the third day. They reached a facility that the Drakathi had tried to destroy. Before retreating, Lieutenant Choi Min-seok led the team that breached the doors, and Valith followed them inside because that was her duty. She wished she had not. The facility had been a research center of some kind, filled with medical equipment and holding cells and detailed records written in the Drakathi clicking language. The subjects of the research had been children, hundreds of them, taken from across the conquered territories and used for experiments that Valith's translation software refused to fully render. Some of the children were still alive, hidden in a basement section that the Drakathi had not had time to purge. They were not in good condition. Valith watched the humans carry those children out into the light, watched medics work frantically to save lives that were barely holding on, watched soldiers who had faced plasma fire without flinching break down and weep at the sight of what had been done to innocent sand. Then she watched something else happen, something that made her understand why the galaxy would one day speak of humans with fear in their voices. The crying stopped, the grief stopped, even the frantic medical efforts seemed to take on a different quality. as if the humans had simply decided that emotion was a luxury they could no longer afford. Sergeant Quan Hai-jin walked past Valith without seeing her, and the Corvani observer barely recognized the woman she had come to know over the past 3 days. The sergeant's face had gone completely blank, emptied of everything except a cold focus that seemed to lower the temperature of the air around her. "Sergeant?" Valith called out hesitantly. Quan stopped but did not turn around. "We have a word on Earth," she said, her voice flat and terrible. "We call it wrath. It is different from anger, different from rage, different from the hot emotions that burn fast and fade quickly. What is it? It is the cold thing that happens when someone hurts the innocent, when they harm children, when they torture those who cannot fight back, when they commit acts so evil that the universe itself seems to demand an answer." The sergeant finally turned, and Valith took an involuntary step backward. There was nothing human in those eyes anymore, nothing she recognized as emotion or feeling or mercy. There was only purpose. Vast and terrible and absolutely certain. "The Drakathi think they know cruelty," Quan said softly. "They think they understand what it means to be a predator, to be the monster that other species fear." "Sergeant, what are you?" "They are about to learn the difference between cruelty and justice, observer." She turned and walked away, and Valith noticed that every human in sight had the same expression, the same cold emptiness, the same terrible focus. Lieutenant Choi approached her a few minutes later, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something far more dangerous. "You should record what happens next." "Observer," he told her, "the galaxy needs to understand what humans become when you give them a reason. What do you become?" The lieutenant looked toward the distant capital city, where the Drakathi warlord waited behind walls that had never been breached. "There is an old saying among my people, do not wake the sleeping giant, for when it rises in terrible resolve. I do not understand. You will that night." Admiral Park addressed his forces through the communication network, and Valith listened to his words with growing unease. "I have seen the reports from the research facility," the admiral said, his voice carrying across thousands of soldiers. "I have seen what they did to those children, and I know that every one of you has seen it too." Silence from the gathered humans, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. "Tomorrow we assault the capital. The tacticians say it cannot be done, that the Drakathi have too many warriors, too many defenses, too many advantages." Park paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I say those children deserve an answer. I say the dead deserve justice. I say that no wall is high enough and no army is large enough to protect those who harm the innocent from the consequences of their choices." Sound began to build among the human soldiers, not cheering, not shouting, but something deeper, a low rumble of agreement that seemed to come from their very bones. "Tomorrow the Drakathi will learn why humanity walks softly among the stars," Admiral Park concluded. "Tomorrow they will understand why wise species count us as friends rather than enemies. Tomorrow the galaxy will remember what happens when you wake the sleeping giant." The rumble became a roar, and Valith felt her first stand on end. As the sound washed over her, she looked at the humans around her, at their cold eyes, and their clenched fists, and their terrible silence between the roars, and she finally understood what she was witnessing. This was not an army preparing for battle. This was a force of nature, gathering itself to strike, and the Drakathi, for all their cruelty and power, had no idea what was coming for them. "I witnessed humanity storm the battlefield and discovered why worlds tremble 1 month after the liberation of Theris 4. Valith stood before the Coalition High Council and prepared to deliver the most important report of her life. The chamber was vast, filled with representatives from 100 different species, all of them waiting to hear her account of what had happened on that burning world. She had spent weeks preparing her words, reviewing her recordings, trying to find the right way to explain what she had witnessed. In the end, she abandoned her prepared remarks and spoke from somewhere deeper. Honored representatives, I was sent to Theris 4 to document a coalition retreat, she began, her voice steady despite the thousands of eyes watching her. Instead, I documented something that I believe will reshape our understanding of galactic politics for centuries to come. The chamber fell silent. The humans are not what we thought they were. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, quickly silenced by the council speaker's gesture for quiet. We have classified them as a young species, primitive, insignificant, a minor player in galactic affairs, who could safely be ignored while we focused on more pressing concerns. She paused, gathering her thoughts. We were wrong. Valeth activated her neural link, projecting her recordings onto the massive display screens that lined the chamber walls. Images of the battle flickered across the screens, humans charging into plasma fire, humans carrying wounded comrades through burning streets, humans standing defiant against impossible odds. I watched 12 human ships take on a fleet 5 times their size. She continued, I watched human soldiers advance against fortified positions that had held for months against our best forces. More images, the liberation of villages, the discovery of the research facility, the faces of children being carried to safety. I watched them discover horrors that would have broken any other army, and I watched them transform that horror into something I can only describe as righteous fury. The final images appeared, the assault on the capital, the fall of the warlord's fortress, Admiral Park standing over his defeated enemy, and I watched them show mercy when they had every right to demand revenge. Valeth turned off the display and faced the council directly. The humans are not primitive, she said firmly. They are something far more dangerous. They are a species that has stared into the face of their own mortality and made peace with it. And that peace has freed them from the fears that constrain the rest of us. Ambassador Creveth of the Monetary Union raised a manipulator arm. Are you suggesting that humanity poses a threat to galactic stability? He asked, his tone skeptical. I am suggesting that humanity represents an opportunity. Valeth replied, they could be the most devastating enemy the galaxy has ever seen. A species that does not fear death, does not retreat from impossible odds, does not stop until their objective is achieved. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Or they could be the most valuable ally any of us could hope for, a species that fights for justice, protects the innocent, and shows mercy even to those who have given them every reason to be merciless. Which are they? The council speaker asked. That depends entirely on us. The debate that followed lasted for hours, but Valeth barely heard of their mind was elsewhere back on Theris 4. Back with the humans who had taught her what courage truly meant. She thought of Sergeant Quan, who had survived her wounds and was already preparing for the next deployment. She thought of Lieutenant Choi, who had lost an arm in the final assault, but joked that it gave him an excuse to get a cybernetic upgrade. She thought of Admiral Park, who had led his forces to victory against impossible odds, and then wept at the memorial service for those who had not survived to see it. She had attended that memorial service 3 days after the battle ended. It was held in a clearing outside the liberated capital, with the names of the fallen displayed on portable screens that the humans had brought from their ships. There were so many names. Admiral Park had stood before his soldiers, some wounded, some whole, all of them marked by what they had endured, and spoken words that Valeth would never forget. They gained everything so that others might live. He had said, his voice rough with grief. They faced the darkness so that children they would never meet could grow up in the light. He had paused, struggling to maintain his composure. We carry them with us now, their courage, their sacrifice, their love, and we honor their memory by continuing to fight for what is right." The soldiers had remained silent, but Valeth had seen tears streaming down faces that had shown no fear in the midst of battle. Humans wept for their dead. She realized they mourned each loss as if it was personal, as if every soldier was family. It was such a strange contradiction. A species that accepted death so completely, yet grieved for it so deeply. She understood now that there was no contradiction at all. Humans did not accept death because they did not value life. They accepted death because they valued life so much that they were willing to sacrifice their own to protect others. The coalition voted that day to offer humanity a permanent seat on the High Council. Some argued they were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too different from the established powers. Others argued that was exactly why they needed to be allies rather than outsiders. The vote was close, but in the end the ayes carried. Valeth left the council chamber feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. She returned to her homeworld the following week, to a family that had worried about her every day she was gone. Her offspring gathered around her that first evening, full of questions about her adventures among the stars. "Mother, what are humans like?" her youngest asked, wide eyes full of curiosity and just a hint of fear. Valeth thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about Sergeant Quan charging into plasma fire. She thought about Admiral Park showing mercy to a monster. She thought about soldiers weeping for fallen comrades they would never see again. "They are small," she finally answered. "Smaller than us, weaker than many species, with short lives and fragile bodies. Then why does everyone say they are so frightening?" Valeth pulled her offspring close, remembering the cold fire she had seen in human eyes when they discovered what the Dracathi had done to children, because they have learned something that most species never understand. She said softly, "They have learned that strength is not about size or weapons or armor. It is about what you are willing to sacrifice for those you love." Are they monsters? Valeth thought of all the deaths she had witnessed, all the fury and the grief and the terrible violence. Then she thought of mercy offered to a defeated enemy, of tears shed for the fallen, of soldiers who carried wounded comrades through fire because leaving them behind was simply not an option. "No," she answered, her voice firm with conviction. "They are what happens when a species evolves to survive everything, including themselves, and then chooses to use that strength to protect rather than destroy." She looked out the window at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "That is why worlds tremble at their name." Little one, not because humans are cool, but because they are capable of both terrible violence and profound kindness, and they have earned the wisdom to know which to choose. Her offspring was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "I want to meet a human someday," the child finally said. Valeth smiled, thinking of Sergeant Quan's fierce grin and Admiral Park's gentle tears. "Perhaps you will," she said. "And when you do, remember this. If you want humanity as a friend, all you have to do is show them kindness. And if you make them an enemy?" Valeth's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "Then pray that their mercy runs deeper than their wrath." Outside, the stars burned cold and distant, and somewhere among them, a young species was continuing its journey toward a destiny that would shake the foundations of the galaxy itself. The Dracathi had been the first to learn why worlds tremble at the name of humanity. They would not be the last. I witnessed humanity storm the battlefield and discovered why worlds tremble. The assault on the Dracathi capital began at dawn, and Valeth knew immediately that she was witnessing something that would be remembered for centuries. Admiral Park called it Protocol Tempest, a full combined arms assault that every military analyst in the coalition had declared impossible. Orbital strikes hammered the outer defenses with precision that seemed almost personal, each bombardment targeting exactly the positions needed to create gaps in the Dracathi lines. Ground Forces advanced from 6 different directions simultaneously. Their movements coordinated with a complexity that made Valith's head spin, and in the air above them, human fighters screamed through the smoke-filled sky like avenging spirits, drawing fire away from the soldiers below even as they hunted. Drakathi aircraft with relentless efficiency. Valith ran with Sergeant Kwan's squad, her legs burning and her lungs aching as they pushed through the first defensive line. The Drakathi had fortified this position for months, building walls of reinforced chitin and fields of automated weapons designed to shred any attacking force. The humans went through it in less than 30 minutes. "Keep moving," Kwan shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos of plasma fire and explosions. "Do not stop for anything." A Drakathi warrior burst from cover directly in front of them, its massive form towering over the humans as it raised a weapon that could have killed a dozen soldiers with one burst. Lieutenant Choi was faster. He threw himself at the creature without hesitation, his combat knife finding the gap between its armor plates, even as its weapon discharged into the ground beside him. The Drakathi fell, and Choi rose from its corpse, bleeding from a wound that would have stopped any sane soldier. "I said, keep moving," he growled, and then he was running again, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Valith followed because she did not know what else to do. The battle became a blur of fire and death and desperate struggle, each moment blending into the next until time itself seemed to lose meaning. She saw humans die, saw them fall and not rise, saw their bodies broken by weapons designed to destroy far larger creatures. But for every human who fell, a dozen Drakathi died with them, and the humans never stopped. They flowed around obstacles like water, adapted to changing conditions like wind, struck at weaknesses like lightning. When one squad was pinned down, another would appear from an unexpected angle to break the stalemate when a position seemed impossible to take. The humans would simply find another way, climbing walls that should have been unscalable, squeezing through gaps that should have been too small. The Drakathi commanders began broadcasting on open channels, their clicking voices translated by Valith's implant into words of growing confusion and fear. "They are not following standard assault patterns," one reported. "They are not responding to suppressive fire," screamed another. "They will not stop," a third shrieked, and then the channel went dead as human forces overran his position. By midday, the outer walls had fallen, and the human forces pushed into the city itself. This was supposed to be the hard part: urban combat against a fortified enemy with superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain. The Drakathi had prepared for a siege that would last months. It lasted hours. Valith watched humans fight through buildings and streets with a ferocity that seemed to defy the limits of their small bodies. She saw Sergeant Kwan take a son, take a son, take a son, take a sign to set his small bodies. She saw Sergeant Kwan take a swiding. Plasma burst to her shoulder that should have ended her combat effectiveness, only to watch the woman bind the wound with one hand while continuing to fire with the other. She saw soldiers carry their wounded comrades on their backs while still engaging the enemy, refusing to leave anyone behind. Even when doing so put the entire squad at risk. She saw humans die screaming and humans die silent, and humans who kept fighting even as the life drained from their eyes. And through it all she saw the Drakathi begin to break, not from casualties. They had suffered worse and kept fighting on other worlds, not from tactical failure. Their commanders were skilled, and their warriors were among the best in the galaxy. They broke because they had never faced anything like this before. They had conquered dozens of species, shattered empires, ground entire civilizations into dust. And through all of it, they had believed themselves to be the ultimate predators. Now they were learning what it felt like to be prey. The warlord's fortress sat at the center of the capital, a massive structure of black chitin and stolen technology that had never been breached in the entire history of the Drakathi. Dominion Admiral Park looked at it through eyes that held no doubt. No hesitation, no mercy. All units converge on the central fortress, he ordered, his voice carrying across every human communication. Device, we finish this now. The final assault was the worst fighting Valith had ever witnessed. The Drakathi warlord had gathered his elite guard around him, the largest, most heavily armed, most fanatically loyal warriors. In his entire dominion, they fought with the desperate fury of creatures who knew that defeat meant the end of everything they had built. The humans fought harder. Valith found herself in the midst of it somehow, pressed against a wall with Sergeant Quan beside her as plasma fire turned the corridor ahead into a killing zone. We cannot get through, Valith shouted. Yes, we can, Quan replied, and there was absolute certainty in her voice. You could die. I could, the sergeant agreed, but those children did not get a choice. The innocent who suffered did not get to decide whether they lived or died. So I am going to make sure that the monsters who hurt them do not get that choice either. She rose from cover and charged directly into the plasma fire, screaming something in her native tongue that Valith's translator rendered as "for the fallen." A dozen humans followed her. Half of them died before they reached the Drakathi position. The other half were enough. The throne room doors fell minutes later, blown apart by human explosives, and Valith stumbled through the wreckage to witness the final confrontation. The Drakathi warlord was massive, twice the size of his warriors, armored in ceremonial chitin that had been blessed by his species' dark gods. He stood before his throne with weapons drawn. Surrounded by the last of his guard, Admiral Park stood before him with a handful of battered soldiers, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him, and somehow still standing. You cannot win, the warlord clicked, his translator rendering his words in flat, mechanical tones. You have lost too many. We will overwhelm you, and then we will hunt down every human in this galaxy. Admiral Park smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Valith had ever seen on any face. You still do not understand, he said quietly. This was never about winning. Then, what was it about? Justice. The final battle lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the warlord knelt in his own blood, his weapons shattered, his guard dead around him, and Admiral Park stood over him with a sidearm pointed at his head. Valith waited for the execution. It did not come. You will stand trial for your crimes, Park said, lowering his weapon. You will face judgment from the species you have wronged, and the galaxy will see that humanity destroys monsters, but we do not become them. The warlord stared up at him with something that might have been confusion. Why? He asked. Why show mercy when you could take revenge? Admiral Park turned away, gesturing for his soldiers to secure the prisoner. Because the dead do not want us to become like you, he answered. They want us to be better, and we will honor their memory by showing the galaxy what strength truly looks like. Valith finally understood the humans had not come to Theres 4 for conquest or glory or revenge. They had come to prove that even in the darkest moments, even against the most terrible evil, it was possible to fight without losing your soul, and that was why the galaxy would tremble at their name for generations to come.